Diesel prices, both on highway and off highway, are both experiencing this massive shift in volatility, and it's really moved in one direction and up.
Deborah Lockridge, Heavy Duty Trucking Editor and Associate Publisher, and this is HDT Talks Trucking. I'm talking to Jenny Vander Zanden. She's Chief Operating Officer of Breakthrough Fuel.
Correct.
So what are you hearing out there regarding our current volatile diesel fuel situation?
Yeah, the fuel markets, it's no surprise to many, but the fuel markets have entered a period of very heightened volatility. And that volatility has certainly been driven by geopolitical disruptions, refinery challenges, and it's created some pretty sharp movements in crude. Not only driving the commodity cost of energy, but also in some of the refining costs that are particularly influencing diesel cost exposure. Diesel up. So I think for a lot of fleets, especially private fleets, where that cost directly hits the bottom line and the P&L, fuel's getting a lot of attention because prices are high. It's an abrupt shift, and it's really driving a lot of focus to be able to see what can we do in the short term, what can we do in the long term to help mitigate some of the increases we've seen up.
Breakthrough has been around for decades, working with shippers on sustainable fuel and freight solutions, but only recently started consulting with trucking fleets after last year's purchase of Sokolos Group, a fleet fuel management consulting company that I've worked with for years on fuel buying articles. So what are some of the things that trucking fleets can do short term, that can do now to try to mitigate some of the effects of these crazy price hikes?
Yeah, I think three big areas that fleets can focus on in the immediate term, purchasing, reducing consumption, and then just thinking about the optimization of their route planning processes. First, on the purchasing side, securing really competitive discounts. But it's not just about having really good discounts and knowing where you're purchasing. It's also about driving compliance to those discounts and make sure that you're achieving the optimal performance for the network that's created. Secondly, reducing consumption. Consumption is a big driver. The best gallon to buy is the one you don't have to buy. And that's really the optimal way to manage it. Investments in tractor trailers, those are going to take time. And often a capital outlay. So typically that's not the immediate abrupt. Many fleets have already invested in equipment that may make them less subject to the volatility in the market. But there's the reality that, proper maintenance, driver behavior can really drive some near-term influences to improving fuel economy. Things like, monitoring speed, reducing idle, coaching driver behavior from harsh braking or idling can really improve consumption in the very near term. There's a lot of capabilities around driver scorecards. Some of the things that I think are really great is, there may have always been a driver scorecard, but now the ability to tailor driver feedback on some of these newer tools so that feedback isn't general across all drivers, but really thinks about the conditions that a specific driver is in and how they can improve their practices to drive a better fuel economy. The last one is just optimization of routing. If you can optimize miles or if you can take less trips by improving load fill, it's just a great way to reduce overall cost, just taking waste out of the system.
So I think when people are talking about fuel, their first thought is probably the usage, miles per gallon, idle percentage. But what are some of the other numbers that a fleet ought to be looking at that could lead them to helping to save money on fuel?
Yeah, looking at things like how many fuel cards you have. That can be a really big influence. If you can consolidate your purchases into transaction cards, it can be easier to manage. You can look at reduced overhead or reduced management. Things like how many different fuel providers you work with, and do you have the right ones? And then auditing transactions. And that may not be like the super awesome thing that you can't wait to get into as a project, but the reality is auditing transactions can help reduce and mitigate exposure to theft, to maybe misuse of a card or misuse of an improper discount, and that can have a really big impact to the bottom line. It's more of an administrative function that creates a lot of value in the management of fuel.
for fleets that like buy bulk fuel, invoices, I would imagine that's something that, you know, it's like with medical bills. A lot of people, they get their medical bills or EOBs, they don't look at them, and they could be missing all sorts of mistakes that were made on that, on the coding, on your
Yeah.
insurance. I think that would kind of be similar maybe on fuel invoices.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Fuel invoices aren't standardized across the industry. It's very unique. Little plug for myself here, but that's why we think a partner can really help you be able to investigate through them, know the best practices, know and understand the tools and some of the common challenges associated with different transactions and audits, and be able to kind of spot and identify where those risks lie. That way it can help you create the right controls and help you manage those risks to be able to lower cost.
Negotiating discounts, because how big do you have to be able to negotiate fuel discounts? You know, is that something a smaller fleet might be able to do, or, you know, they throw up their arms and go, oh, I'm not, you know, Werner or Swift or some big company?
Yeah, it is something that fleets of all sizes can do. I do think it's, you know, in many ways it can feel a bit overwhelming if you don't have the relationships. And that's where, you know, we sit as a unique partner to help identify great opportunities to really leverage volume and spend, to be able to procure those discounts and to know what a good deal is. You know, most fleets aren't buying off of that retail posted price, but rather some discount level. And that's going to vary based on the amount of volume you bring or the amount of concentration you have, or how you can really drive and manage those in compliance purchases to be able to maintain those discounts with the providers. It's one thing to have a discount, it's another to really manage towards that discount, increase compliance, and be able to maintain those discounts over time. So they're typically looking for a commitment.
Things that people maybe overlook and don't think about when they're trying to save on their fuel spend.
That's a great question. You know, I think sometimes there's just a lot of data, and it's typically raw data. So, you know, when you have all this data, how do you normalize that data? How do you, you know, rationalize if it's the right purchase for the right types of transactions? And then how do you competitively drive it? I think it's really hard to go from data to insights. And I think the data, because it's not normalized and consistent across cards or bulk purchases or different areas, it can be hard to get a complete view and a picture. And then even harder to get those insights to drive the actions that actually reduce fuel. And so I think part of it is just having your arms around that vast amount of data, knowing the benchmarks in the industry that defines a well-managed carrier, and then how to create that plan to go out there and get it.
I know raw data has for years been a challenge in the industry. Which data do I decide to kind of start with? Where can I get the most bang for my buck?
Yeah.
On fuel, where might that be if I could only sort of start in one place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to first get a baseline. Because if you can't get that baseline, you don't know what you're measuring to. You can't improve what you can't measure. So getting that baseline and then understanding the comparison to benchmark, whether that's at a national level, a regional level, or a local level, depending on your fleet needs. You know, fuel, it's not one number across the entire US. And so really understanding the markets you're operating in and what is best in class. You know, you can look at two states right next to each other and see widely different fuel costs based on the true cost of that fuel.
And what are some of the things when you're talking about a baseline? I mean, is that how much you spend on fuel, how much fuel you buy, fuel mileage? You know, what are some of the things that would be that baseline?
If you start with where you're buying today, that can sometimes leave some differences from where you need to be buying. And so I think sometimes defining what are the needs of my fleet, what are the needs of my network, and starting at that level, and then driving it to the purchasing behavior, and then and the needs of my freight. You know, there's going to be certain fleets that need refrigerated fuel, and that's going to be based on the temperature control settings of their trailers. You know, there's going to be fleets that are in highly congested areas, and they're going to have different fueling needs than those that might be longer length of haul. So I think understanding with an assessment of, you know, what are your freight needs? Where are you consuming, and then where are the greatest opportunities in order to be able to, you know, bridge that gap from needs of the network to baseline to benchmark.
Talking about data, how is artificial intelligence changing how fleets might be able to attack some of this data?
My favorite use cases are in some of the ways that people are thinking about fuel economy. Fuel efficiency, they're always oh, hey, this person achieved, and you're celebrating the highest achievements. But often it was, the perfect conditions, the right truck, and all of these things that influenced it. And so sometimes drivers would be stretching to be able to achieve that goal, but with, a constraint on equipment or a different type of a load or the weight of that load, they couldn't achieve the same thing as another driver in their fleet. What I love about the use of AI is how personal it can get when giving that driver feedback, is it can take in a number of those factors and develop feedback for the driver specifically to be able to help improve the coaching and performance of that individual instead of the collective fleet.
Any other advice that you'd like to share with trucking fleets about saving money on their fuel?
I think there's the topic of saving money on your fuel, but I think a lot of pressure that fleets are feeling is, how do I need to plan and budget for what I'm going to spend? And certainly as we're approaching the end of a quarter here, or have actually just finished the end of a quarter, how do I plan for what costs I'm going to need in the quarter or the rest of the year ahead due to some of the changes in the energy market? So I think especially important for private fleet, where that direct cost hits the P&L and they're really absorbing the full increase of the spend. How are you forecasting the future? Not just what I need today and what I can do to lower it, but how am I planning, and who needs to have that plan to understand the market drivers, the signals to watch, the forecasts. And those are some ways that we're supporting our clients. So if you're not doing that activity today, someone else is doing it for you, and you don't know what position they're taking. So you may want to be able to think about, what should I be planning for? How should I be forecasting? And what insights are really driving the markets for my fleet?
From what I've read, it seems like we're not going to just see prices just suddenly go back down overnight. That even if everything in the Middle East suddenly went great, it takes time to get all that infrastructure back online. It takes time for those global oil markets to get unrattled, I guess. I think that kind of planning and figuring out who can help you make some sort of forecast to plan with, that would be a big help.
And I think, there's a lot of questions coming from high level in the organization seeking out what perspective and what better place to get it than directly within the fleet that's very tied to the costs and watching the indicators. And I think having the right partners and having the right insights there can be really important to helping your organization drive their strategy.
All right, great. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for the insights, and it's good talking to you today.
It's great to talk to you too. Thanks, Deborah.
And it was Jenny Vander Zanden talking about how to save money on fuel costs. Thanks for joining us on HDT Talks Trucking, and be sure to subscribe wherever you watch or listen.